Chapter 1: The Weight of the Crown. The silver incense swirled through the great hall, thick enough to coat the tongue with the metallic tang of ancient rituals. King Kael Thorn stood atop the dais, his spine a rigid pillar of obsidian against the flickering torchlight. Below him, the Shadowclaw pack moved like a restless ocean, their scents a chaotic cocktail of pine, musk, and growing agitation. This was the pop ceremony, a night meant for celebrating the future, yet the air felt heavy with a suffocating, unspoken judgment. Every eye drifted toward the woman standing just a half step behind him. Lyra remained as still as a marble statue, her presence regal, yet the silence surrounding her was a jagged blade. Moving with a predatory grace that masked the hollow ache in his chest, Kael adjusted the heavy, fur-lined mantle on his shoulders. He could feel the elders watching him from the front row, their ancient faces etched with lines of disappointment that felt deeper than any physical wound. Why did the gods grant him the strength to crush armies but deny him the simple legacy of a son? Because his father's blood still stained his memory, he knew that power was a fragile glass orb easily shattered by the slightest hint of domestic failure. He needed to project absolute certainty tonight, even as the council members leaned in to whisper behind gnarled hands. "The lineage must be secured, my king," Elder Silas rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of falling stones. "A throne without an heir is merely a target for the ambitious." Kael tightened his jaw until his teeth groaned under the pressure. He didn't look at Lyra, though her scent, warm honey and rain, was the only thing keeping him grounded in the sweltering heat. He focused instead on the young couples presenting their squirming, golden-eyed infants to the moon. Their joy was a bitter poison in his throat. Was his leadership truly so tied to his loins? The question burned because he already knew the answer in this world of teeth and claw. The pack's collective heartbeat seemed to pulse against the stone walls, a rhythmic demand for a future he couldn't provide. He felt the phantom heat of his father's dying breath against his ear, reminding him that love was the anchor that dragged kings into the abyss. If he showed even a flicker of softness for his barren mate, the wolves would send it like blood in the water. Stepping toward the edge of the platform, he raised his hand to signal the end of the presentation. The silence that followed wasn't respectful, it was expectant, heavy with the demand for an announcement he wasn't ready to make. Beside him, Lyra's fingers brushed his sleeve, a silent plea for a reassurance he didn't have the courage to give. He pulled his arm away, the movement sharp and cold. The collective gasp from the crowd sounded like a death knell. How much longer could he pretend that the crown was enough to keep the shadows at bay? Chapter 2: The Fractured Bond. Inside the private lunar chambers, the walls seemed to lean in, eavesdropping on a silence that had become a physical entity. Kael stared out the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the moonlight wash over the jagged peaks of the Blackwood Range. He didn't need to turn around to know Lyra was standing by the hearth, the firelight dancing in her auburn hair. The warmth of the room felt like a mockery of the ice currently crystallizing in his veins. "Do you still choose me, Kael?" Her voice was a soft vibration, barely reaching him, yet it carried the force of a landslide. He didn't answer immediately because the truth was a jagged thing that would tear his throat if he let it out. He watched a hawk circle the distant trees, wondering if it felt the same crushing pressure of expectation. "The council has spent the evening drafting lists of noble daughters from the northern wastes," he said instead, his tone as flat as a grave marker. "They speak of duty as if it is a holy scripture that justifies any betrayal." Lyra stepped into his line of sight, her eyes shimmering with a vulnerability that made his inner wolf roar in protest. "I am not asking what the council chooses. I am asking what the man who swore his soul to mine chooses." He finally turned, his gaze sweeping over her with a clinical detachment that cost him every ounce of his willpower. "A man and a king are not the same person, Lyra. One has the luxury of a heart, while the other is a vessel for the survival of 10,000 souls." "You are hiding behind that crown again," she whispered, taking a step toward him. "You use it as a shield to protect yourself from the fear that you might actually love me more than your pride." The accusation hit home because it was the absolute, terrifying truth. He remembered the night of their mating, the way the world had simplified into nothing but her scent and the rhythmic pull of the bond. Now, that bond felt like a fraying rope holding him over a precipice. He could sense her despair, a dark, oily current beneath the honey sweetness of her skin, and it made him want to burn the world down just to stop her from hurting. But he didn't reach for her. Instead, he walked toward the door, his boots echoing with a finality that felt like a sentence. "The announcement happens tomorrow at the dawn's first light," he said, his hand resting on the iron latch. "Prepare yourself to accept whatever the throne deems necessary for our survival." He didn't look back, even as he felt the first agonizing tear in the invisible thread connecting their souls. He convinced himself that he was protecting her by distancing himself, a lie that tasted like ash. As he walked down the darkened corridor, a strange, metallic scent began to drift through the air, a scent that didn't belong to any wolf in his pack. Something was shifting in the dark, a secret waiting to be birthed by the very betrayal he was about to commit. Chapter 3: The Public Rejection. The dawn arrived not with a gentle glow, but with a harsh, unforgiving light that stripped away the shadows of the night. The entire pack had gathered at the base of the high crag, a natural stone amphitheater where the most significant decrees were voiced. Kael stood at the precipice, the wind whipping his dark hair across his face. He felt the eyes of his people, thousands of them, waiting for the words that would either stabilize his reign or ignite a revolution. Lyra stood to his left, her white gown fluttering like the wings of a trapped bird. She looked ethereal, yet there was a new hardness in her jaw that hadn't been there the night before. Kael took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. He could feel the council's presence behind him, a row of vultures waiting for their feast. He looked out over the sea of faces and saw the doubt, the hunger for a strong lineage, and the fear of a leaderless future. For generations, the Shadowclaw lineage has remained unbroken, Kael's voice boomed, amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone. The strength of the Alpha is the strength of the pack. We cannot allow sentiment to cloud the necessity of our endurance. He felt Lyra stiffen, her scent turning sharp and acidic. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Therefore, to ensure the continuity of the throne, I decree that we must consider options beyond our current union. The search for a secondary mate will commence immediately. The silence that followed was so profound that the sound of a distant stream seemed like a roar. Then, the gasps began, a wave of shocked murmurs that rippled through the crowd like a physical blow. Kael felt a sudden, violent snap in the center of his chest. It was the mate bond. It didn't just fray, it fractured, sending a surge of raw, agonizing pain through his entire body. He gripped the edge of the stone, his knuckles turning white as he fought to remain upright. Beside him, Lyra didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply turned to look at him, her eyes no longer shimmering with love, but burning with a cold, dead fire. Her scent changed instantly, the honey and rain replaced by the scorched smell of a lightning strike. She was a stranger to him now, a woman he had just publicly sacrificed on the altar of his own cowardice. "You chose the crown," she said, her voice carrying clearly to those in the front rows. "I hope it keeps you warm when the winter comes for your soul, Kael Thorn." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away from the edge of the crag. The pack parted for her in a stunned, respectful silence that felt like a collective condemnation of their king. Kael watched her go, his heart beating a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He had won the stability he sought, but as he stood alone under the rising sun, the victory felt like a hollow, freezing void. That night, when he returned to their chambers, the room was empty. Her scent was already fading, and a single silver feather, a symbol of a rival pack's protection, lay on the center of their bed. She was gone, and the world he had tried so hard to protect began to burn from the inside out. Chapter 4: The Ghost in the Throne Room. 3 years had carved deeper hollows into Kael's cheeks, turning his face into a mask of weathered granite. The great hall felt cavernous now, a tomb of echoing footsteps and the persistent, mocking scent of cold stone where honey and rain used to linger. He sat upon the obsidian throne, his fingers tracing the jagged armrest until the sharp edges bit into his skin. Power was a jealous mistress, it had demanded everything and given him back a kingdom of bowing heads and averted eyes. He watched the shadows stretch across the floor, thinking of how he had traded the sun for a flickering candle. Every decision he made now was filtered through a lens of cold logic, yet the silence of his bedchamber was a deafening roar he couldn't escape. "The northern borders are secure, my king," a commander droned, but Kael barely heard the words. He was preoccupied by the phantom sensation of a fractured bond that refused to heal. Because he had severed the connection with such public cruelty, the wound had turned into a festering scar that throbbed with every beat of his heart. He had convinced himself that she was the weak link in his armor, but without her, the armor was merely a cage. His inner wolf was a silent, brooding beast, pacing the cage of his ribs and refusing to acknowledge the women the council paraded before him. They were empty vessels, lacking the fire that had once matched his own, and their presence only served to highlight the void Lyra had left behind. "Is there news of the scouts?" Kael interrupted, his voice like grinding tectonic plates. The commander faltered, shifting his weight. "Still nothing, sire." It is as if she vanished into the mist itself. Kael dismissed him with a sharp flick of his wrist, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. He hated that he still looked for her in every crowd and scented the wind for a trace of a woman he had cast aside. He told himself it was about the insult to his pride, the fact that a queen of the Shadowclaws had disappeared without a trace. But as he stood and walked toward the window, the way he clutched the sill betrayed the truth. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own making, reaching for a hand he had slapped away 3 years prior. The moon was beginning its ascent, a pale, judgmental eye looking down at his solitary reign. He felt a sudden, sharp prickle at the base of his neck, a sensation of being watched by something old and predatory. It wasn't the usual political maneuvering of his advisors, this was something primal. He turned, scanning the darkened corners of the hall, but saw only the flickering torches. Little did he know that the wind was carrying a change toward his gates, a scent of silver and snow that would shatter the frozen peace he had suffered so much to maintain. Chapter 5: The Silver-Eyed Reckoning. The celebration for the naming of the political mate's newborn son was a masquerade of joy that Kael wore like a leaden shroud. He stood on the dais, watching the pack feast, while the woman beside him preened, her hand resting possessively on the cradle. She was the choice of the council, a fertile bride who had provided the heir he supposedly craved. Yet, as he looked down at the infant, he felt nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. This was the stability he had sacrificed Lyra for, and it felt like a pile of dry bones. Because he had prioritized the bloodline over the soul, the resulting legacy felt hollow and devoid of the spark that makes a dynasty worth defending. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the great hall didn't just open, they exploded inward, the iron hinges screaming in protest. A blast of freezing air swept through the room, extinguishing half the torches and sending a shiver of instinctual fear through the assembled wolves. "Who dares disrupt the royal naming?" Kael roared, his aura flaring until the air around him shimmered with heat. Through the swirling mist of the doorway stepped a figure wrapped in furs of pure white. Beside her walked Alpha Darius of the Silver Moon Pack, a man Kael had nearly killed in a border skirmish a decade ago. But it wasn't the rival Alpha that froze the blood in Kael's veins. It was the woman. Lyra walked with a stride that was no longer hesitant or pleading, she moved with the devastating confidence of a goddess of war. Her hair was longer, braided with silver wire, and her eyes held a depth of cold fury that made Kael's knees feel weak. "I hear the Shadowclaws are celebrating a false future," Lyra's voice rang out, sharper and more resonant than he remembered. Kael's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Lyra," he whispered, the name a prayer and a curse. But his gaze dropped to the child standing at her side. The boy was no more than 3 years old, his small hand tucked firmly into Lyra's. He had Kael's jawline, Kael's dark, unruly hair, and most strikingly, eyes that glowed with a piercing, silver-flecked gold. The boy's scent hit Kael like a physical blow. It was a perfect blend of pine and honey, a genetic signature that was unmistakable. The room fell into a silence so absolute that the crackle of the dying fires sounded like gunshots. Kael felt his entire reality tilt on its axis, the carefully constructed lies of the past 3 years crumbling into dust at the sight of the son he had been told she could never have. Chapter 6: The Barren Lie. The tension in the hall was a live wire, humming with the potential for a massacre. Kael descended the steps of the dais, his movements mechanical, his eyes locked on the child who looked like a miniature reflection of his own soul. He could feel the council members behind him scrambling, their scents turning sour with the sudden, sharp aroma of panic. He didn't care about the politics or the rival alpha standing protectively behind his mate. He only cared about the truth that was currently staring him in the face with defiant, golden eyes. "You called me Barren, Kael Thorn," Lyra said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low vibrato. "You stood before the moon and told our people that I was the reason the throne was empty." Kael stopped a few feet away, his hands trembling so violently he had to clench them into fists. "Lyra." "I was told," the healer said. "The healer said what you wanted to hear so you could justify your cowardice," she spat, her lip curling in a snarl that revealed her lengthening canines. She placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a gesture of absolute possession. "This is Rowan. He was conceived in the shadows of the night you threw me away. He is the true heir of the Shadow Claws, born in the exile you forced upon us." Darius stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of a silver-encrusted dagger. "The Silver Moon Pack has protected your queen and your son while you played at being a king in this graveyard of a castle, Kael. Do not think we will let you claim them now just because your conscience has finally decided to wake up." Kael felt a roar of primal possessiveness rip through his chest, his wolf screaming to tear the rival alpha apart for touching what was mine. But the weight of his own guilt held him back. He looked at the council, seeing the way Elder Silas was looking at the boy, not with wonder, but with a calculating, lethal intent. The realization hit Kael like a splash of ice water. If this boy was the true heir, then the current heir and the political alliance that supported him were in jeopardy. "The child must be tested," Silas shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "We cannot accept the word of a traitor and a rival pack. If the blood is not pure, the law demands execution for the deception." Kael's head snapped toward the elder, his eyes flashing a lethal crimson. The stakes had shifted in a heartbeat from a personal tragedy to a life-or-death struggle for the son he hadn't known existed. He looked at Lyra, seeing the fear she tried to hide behind her mask of rage. He had rejected her once to save his throne. Now, he realized with a terrifying clarity that he would have to burn that same throne to the ground if he wanted to save his son. The war hadn't just arrived at his gates, it was standing in the center of his home, and for the first time in his life, Kael Thorn was truly afraid. Chapter 7: The Lion's Den. The heavy oak doors of the private solar slammed shut, the echo vibrating through the stones like a dying groan. Kael didn't wait for the latch to settle before he spun around, his presence expanding until he seemed to swallow the light from the hearth. He had Lyra cornered against a tapestry of his ancestors, his shadow looming over her like a thundercloud. For 3 years, he had hallucinated this moment, but the reality was far more volatile. Her scent, that intoxicating blend of honey and rain, was now laced with the sharp, icy tang of the Silver Moon Pack, and it drove his inner wolf into a frantic, jealous frenzy. "Whose son is he, Lyra?" Kael's voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated in the very floorboards. Lyra didn't flinch, she didn't even blink. She stared up at him with a defiance that made his blood sing and burn simultaneously. "He is my son. That is all the information you are entitled to after you discarded us like unwanted refuse." Because he could feel the faint, rhythmic pulse of the fractured bond trying to knit itself back together, Kael reached out, his hand hovering near her throat before he gripped the stone wall beside her head. The proximity was a torture of his own making. He could see the pulse jumping in her neck, a frantic rhythm that betrayed her outward calm. He has my eyes. He has the thorn mark on his shoulder. Do not lie to me while the moon is watching. Truth is a luxury you traded for a crown, Kael, she whispered, her breath warm against his chin. You want to play the concerned father now? Where was this protective instinct when you stood on the high crag and let the wind howl through the hole you ripped in my chest? Kael flinched as if she had struck him with a silver blade. The guilt was a physical weight, a crushing pressure that made it hard to draw air into his lungs. He wanted to shake her, to kiss her, to beg for a forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. But the king in him, the man raised on a diet of iron and silence, only tightened his jaw. He was desperate to claim the boy, to feel the weight of his legacy in his arms, yet the wall Lyra had built between them was higher and thicker than any fortress he had ever besieged. Chapter 8, Blood on the Marble. The hallway was a labyrinth of long shadows and the oppressive silence of a house divided against itself. Kael walked with Rowan, the boy who moved with a miniature version of his own predatory gait, toward the nursery wing. He had insisted on personally overseeing the boys' quarters, a move that had the council whispering of madness. As they passed a suit of ancient armor, Kael noticed a flicker of movement in the reflection of a polished shield. He didn't think, he simply reacted, his body moving with the blurred speed of a seasoned apex predator. A crossbow bolt hissed through the air, aimed directly at the small of Rowan's back. Kael lunged, his mantle snapping like a whip as he threw himself over the child. The bolt didn't thud into stone, it found the meat of Kael's shoulder with a sickening, wet crunch. He let out a sharp hiss of breath, his vision tunneling into a lethal, predatory red. He didn't feel the pain, not yet, because the primal need to protect the pup overrode every other nerve ending in his body. He scooped Rowan up with his good arm, shielding the boy's face against his chest as he scanned the rafters with glowing, murderous eyes. Behind the pillar! Kael roared, his voice summoning the palace guards who were already sprinting toward the commotion. Lyra appeared from the shadows of the adjacent corridor, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She saw the blood blooming across Kael's tunic, the dark red stains spreading rapidly over the gray wool. For a heartbeat, the mask of the vengeful queen slipped, and he saw the woman who used to press her ear to his chest just to hear his heart beat. She reached for Rowan, her hands trembling as she pulled the boy into her arms, checking him for wounds with frantic, searching fingers. He's safe, Kael ground out through gritted teeth, the silver-tipped bolt in his shoulder beginning to burn as the poison met his blood. I have him. He's safe. As the guards dragged a hooded figure from the shadows, Kael realized that the priorities of his life had shifted irrevocably in the span of a single breath. He had spent years protecting a throne made of cold wood and colder laws, but as he watched Lyra clutch their son, he knew he would burn the entire kingdom to ash to keep that look of terror off her face again. The question of who had ordered the hit was already answered in his mind. The scent of the assassin's cloak was the same oily, perfumed musk favored by the High Council. Chapter 9, The Healer's Treason. The infirmary smelled of dried herbs, copper, and the bitter scent of dying hope. Kael sat on the edge of the stone table, his shirt discarded as the royal healer worked to extract the bolt. Every movement was an agony that Kael bore with a frightening, silent intensity. Lyra stood by the window, her back to him, her posture as rigid as a spear. She hadn't spoken since the attack, but the air between them was thick with the unspoken realization that the castle was no longer a sanctuary, it was a cage full of starving wolves. The bolt was coated in wolfsbane, my king, the healer murmured, his hands shaking as he dropped the bloodied iron into a basin. A slow-acting strain. Designed to weaken, not kill instantly. Kael looked at the man, an elder who had served his father before him. Tell me about the records, Marcus. Tell me about the moon cycle reports from 3 years ago. The healer froze, his eyes darting toward the door. Because he saw the lethal calculation in Kael's gaze, the old man collapsed to his knees, his forehead hitting the cold floor. They forced my hand, sire. Silas, he said the pack would never follow a queen whose bloodline was tainted by the northern lineages. They forged the infertility scrolls while you were at the border wars. Kael felt a coldness settle over him that was far more terrifying than the poison in his veins. He looked at Lyra, who had finally turned around. Her eyes were wide, the shock of the revelation stripping away her armor. She had spent 3 years believing her body had failed her, believing she was the reason for the crown's hollow legacy, when in reality, it had been a calculated execution of her dignity by the men Kael trusted most. "You let them convince you I was broken," Lyra whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. "You believed their ink and parchment over the soul of your own mate." Kael stood up, the pain in his shoulder a dull throb compared to the agonizing roar of his own failure. He realized then that his pride hadn't just cost him a wife and a son, it had made him a puppet for the very men he claimed to lead. He walked toward her, his bare chest heaving, the blood from his wound trickling down his ribs. He didn't try to touch her, he knew he didn't have the right, but he stood close enough that she had to look into the depths of his self-loathing. "I will have their heads," Kael promised, his voice a jagged promise of violence. "Every man who touched those scrolls, every man who whispered in my ear while I was blinded by my own arrogance, they will learn what happens when a king realizes he has nothing left to lose." He could see the midpoint of his life approaching, a sharp, narrow bridge where he would have to choose between the crown he had spent his life polishing and the family he had spent his life destroying. The coup was no longer a distant threat, it was a fire already licking at the foundations of his home. As he looked at Lyra, he saw a flicker of something new in her eyes, not forgiveness, but a shared, lethal purpose. They were no longer just a king and an exiled queen, they were two predators whose cub had been threatened, and the Shadowclaw Council was about to realize they had awakened a monster they couldn't control. Chapter 10, The Crypt of Secrets. The air in the subterranean archives was stagnant, thick with the dust of centuries and the smell of decaying parchment. Kael moved through the narrow aisles like a vengeful ghost, his shoulder burning where the wolfsbane had left a jagged, purple bruise. He didn't need a torch, his eyes glowed with a low, predatory amber that cut through the gloom. He was hunting for the truth, a scent more elusive than any prey he had ever chased through the blackwood forests. Because he had allowed his counsel to whisper lies into the hollows of his heart, he now felt every step into the darkness was a penance for his own stupidity. He found the ledger tucked behind a stack of ancient tax records, a leather-bound volume embossed with the healer's personal seal. His fingers trembled as he flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the dates until he found the month of Lyra's exile. There, in cold, clinical ink, were the results of her final examination. Subject: Queen Lyra. Status: peak fertility. Blood essence: potent. Below it, in a handwriting he recognized as Elder Silas's, was a single, devastating command: report as Barren. Secure the Southern Alliance through the new bloodline. The paper crumpled in Kael's grip. The sound was like a bone snapping in the silence of the vault. He leaned his forehead against the cold stone shelf, a jagged sob catching in his throat that he refused to let go. He hadn't just lost 3 years, he had participated in the psychological dismantling of the woman he loved. Every time he had looked at her with pity, every time he had turned away in the bedroom to hide his disappointment, he had been a weapon in the council's hands. He was the king, yet he had been the most ignorant man in the kingdom. A soft footfall echoed behind him. He didn't need to turn to know it was Lyra. Her scent was a quiet hum in the darkness. "You found it," she said, her voice devoid of inflection. "They used my pride as a blindfold," Kael whispered, his voice cracking. "They knew I would choose the throne over a failing mate, so they made sure you appeared to fail. I was the architect of my own misery, Lyra." He turned to face her, the ledger held between them like a smoking gun. He saw the way she looked at the book, not with surprise, but with a weary, soul-deep exhaustion. She had lived this lie in her own skin while he had only lived it in his head. The realization was a new kind of agony. He wanted to burn the archives to the ground, to erase the history that had stolen their happiness, but he knew that fire wouldn't be enough to cleanse the stain on his soul. Chapter 11, The Midnight Ghost. Memory was a cruel companion in the dead of night. As Kael sat in his darkened study, the ledger open on the desk before him, his mind drifted back to the night Lyra left. He remembered the rain lashing against the windows and the way she had come to him one last time, her eyes red-rimmed but her spirit still fighting. They had spiraled into a desperate, silent passion, a final attempt to bridge the chasm his words had created. Because he had been so convinced of her infertility, he had seen that night as a tragic goodbye rather than a beginning. He closed his eyes and could almost feel the heat of her skin, the way her nails had dug into his shoulders as if trying to hold onto a crumbling cliffside. He counted back the moons from Rowan's birth. The math was perfect. The boy hadn't just been conceived in exile, he had been conceived in the very heart of Kael's betrayal. Rowan was the physical manifestation of the love Kael had tried to kill with logic. "I am a fool," Kael murmured to the empty room. "A king of nothing." The internal monologue of his wolf was a relentless snarl of self-loathing. It paced behind his ribs, demanding he find Silas and tear the old man's throat out. But Kael knew that blood alone wouldn't fix this. The stakes had transcended a simple lie. He had a son who didn't know him and a mate who saw him as her primary tormentor. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had held his father's cooling body, and realized they were stained with a different kind of blood, the slow bleeding death of Lyra's trust. He stood up, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. He needed to see the boy. He needed to look at the living proof of his failure and his hope. As he walked toward the guest wing where the Silver Moon Guard stood watch, he realized the palace felt more like an enemy camp than a home. The very walls seemed to watch him, the stones infused with the whispers of the men who were even now plotting to remove the problem of his true heir. The midpoint of his journey was behind him, there was no going back to the man who cared about the purity of the bloodline. There was only the man who would die to hear his son call him father. Chapter 12, The Serpent's Coil. The political mate, Elena, stood in the center of the solar, her silk gown rustling like a nest of vipers. She was a woman of ambition, chosen by the council to replace the Barren queen, and the presence of Rowan was a direct threat to her son's future. Kael watched her from the doorway, noting the way her eyes narrowed as she looked at the cradle in the corner. She wasn't a wolf of the Shadowclaw, she was a creature of the southern courts, where poison was more common than prayer. "You are being distracted by a ghost and a bastard, Kael," Elena said, her voice like honey poured over a blade. "The council is restless. The southern lords are already questioning the validity of our contract." Kael stepped into the room, his presence snuffing at her composure like a candle flame. "The bastard is my blood, Elena. And the ghost is the only queen this pack has ever recognized." Because he saw the flash of genuine hatred in her eyes, Kael knew the alliance was already dead. He had rejected her in his heart the moment Lyra walked through those doors, but voicing it was the final spark in the powder keg. Elena took a step back, her fingers clutching a small, ornate vial hidden in the folds of her dress. "You are choosing a ruin over a kingdom. They will not let you keep both. Silas has already summoned the Great Hunt. They will claim the boy is a changeling, a Silver Moon spy." "Let them try," Kael growled, his shadow lengthening until it climbed the walls. "You think you are strong because you can fight," she sneered, her voice rising in a frantic pitch. "But you are weak because you care. A king who loves is a king who can be broken. They are already forming the coup, Kael. By dawn, you will either be a father in a grave or a king in chains." She swept past him, the scent of bitter almonds lingering in her wake. Kael stood alone, the weight of the impending war settling onto his shoulders. He had forced himself to choose between his image and his heart, and the choice was finally clear. The pressure was intensifying, the air in the palace becoming thin and electric. He knew that the next 24 hours would decide the fate of the Shadowclaws. He had to reach Lyra, to warn her, to somehow convince her that the man who had rejected her was dead, replaced by a man who was ready to watch the world burn if it meant his family survived the flames. Chapter 13, The Shield of the King. The great hall was a sea of bared teeth and low, rumbling growls that vibrated in the very marrow of Kael's bones. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient, dusty law, a suffocating atmosphere that usually signaled a death sentence. At the center of the pit stood Lyra, her chin tilted high, while the High Council circled her like a pack of vultures. Elder Silas held a scroll aloft, his voice cracking like a whip as he declared her presence a violation of the Great Pact. Because Kael had spent years cultivating a culture of absolute obedience to the law, he now watched his own weapons being turned against the woman he had sworn to protect. She returns with the scent of a rival alpha upon her skin. Silas barked, his eyes darting toward the restless warriors in the galleries. She brings a child of unknown lineage to claim a throne that has already been promised to the south. Kael didn't wait for the council's formal invitation to speak. He moved from the shadows of the dais, his boots echoing with a heavy, deliberate rhythm that silenced the room. He didn't stand behind his throne, he stepped down into the pit, placing his body directly between Lyra and the snarling elders. The movement was a calculated suicide of his political reputation. He could feel the shock rippling through the pack, a wave of confusion that tasted like copper on his tongue. He was no longer the distant arbiter of justice, he was a shield. The lineage is not unknown, Kael growled, his voice dropping an octave into a register that made the torches flicker. The boy carries my soul in his eyes. Anyone who calls him a bastard calls their king a liar. Lyra's hand brushed against his lower back, a fleeting, electric touch that nearly shattered his composure. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid and fierce, matching the thrum of his own pulse. Because he saw the way Silas's hand drifted toward the hilt of a ceremonial dagger, Kael realized that words were no longer sufficient. He was witnessing the death of his authority and the birth of a rebellion. He looked out at his warriors, seeing the divided loyalties etched into their faces, and he knew that by shielding her, he had officially declared war on his own government. Chapter 14, The Breaking of the Crown. The midnight air in the royal solar was cold, but the heat radiating from Kael's body could have melted stone. Elena stood by the window, her silhouette sharp and unforgiving against the moon. She had heard of his performance in the pit, and the scent of her fury was a cloying, floral rot that filled the room. Kael didn't bother with pleasantries. He crossed the floor in 3 strides, his presence forcing her to shrink back against the glass. The political alliance that had been his safety net for 3 years was now a noose he was determined to cut. "You will leave the Shadowclaw lands by sunrise," Kael stated, his tone as final as a falling axe. "The contract is void. The southern lords can take their gold and their grievances back to the coast." Elena's face contorted, her beauty curdling into a mask of pure, unadulterated spite. "You would throw away a kingdom for a woman who has spent 3 years in the bed of your enemy? You are not a king, Kael Thorn. You are a dog returning to its vomit." Kael didn't flinch at the insult. He felt a strange, liberating lightness in his chest, the weight of the crown finally lifting as he accepted the cost of his choice. "I would rather be a dog with a soul than a king with a heart of stone. Your son will be provided for, but he will not sit on this throne. It belongs to the heir of the true queen." Because he had finally voiced the truth, the world seemed to shift into a sharper, more dangerous focus. Elena let out a shrill, mocking laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "You think it's that simple? Silas has already sent the messengers. The South is moving their heavy infantry to the border, and your own generals are meeting in the barracks to discuss your replacement. You haven't saved Lyra, you've just ensured you'll both die together." She swept past him, her silk gown hissing against the floor like a serpent. Kael stood in the center of the room, listening to the silence that followed. It wasn't a peaceful silence, it was the breath before a storm. He had officially rejected the only political support he had left, making war not just a possibility, but an absolute certainty. He looked at his hands and saw they were steady. He had lost his allies, his reputation, and his security, yet for the first time in 3 years, he felt like he could finally breathe. Chapter 15, The Full Moon Execution. The drums began at the stroke of midnight, a slow, rhythmic thud that echoed up from the dungeon levels and vibrated through the palace foundations. Kael sprinted through the corridors, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had been lured to the armory by a false report of a breach, only to realize too late that the target wasn't the gates, but the guest wing. Because he had underestimated Silas's desperation, he now found himself racing against a clock that was already winding down. He reached the high square just as the torches were being lit. Lyra was being led toward the executioner's block, her hands bound with silver-threaded rope that smoked against her skin. Rowan was nowhere to be seen, a fact that sent a cold, paralyzing dread through Kael's veins. Silas stood atop the platform, the moonlight catching the edge of a massive, two-handed blade. The crowd was small, comprised only of the council's personal guard and the most radical traditionalists. This wasn't a public trial, it was a private murder disguised as a ritual. By the law of the ancient pack, the traitor and her changeling spawn are condemned. Silas shouted, his voice amplified by the stillness of the night. "Stop!" Kael's roar ripped through the square, a sound so primal it made the guards stumble back. He skidded to a halt at the base of the platform, his eyes glowing a lethal, incandescent red. His muscles bunched beneath his tunic, the shift hovering just beneath his skin, straining for release. He looked at Lyra, seeing the raw, feral protectiveness in her gaze. She wasn't looking at the blade, she was looking for their son. The realization that Silas must have hidden the boy to use as leverage or to dispose of in secret turned Kael's blood into liquid fire. "Where is the boy, Silas?" Kael's voice was a whisper now, a sound more terrifying than any shout. "The boy is being purified," the elder sneered, gesturing for the guards to close in. "And you, Kael, are no longer fit to wear the fur. You have chosen a mate over the pack. The moon demands a sacrifice for your weakness." The guards lunged. Kael felt his bones crack and reset as the shift took hold, his fury finally overflowing the banks of his self-control. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore, he was a father whose cub was in the dark, and a mate whose queen was on the block. The full moon hung overhead, a cold witness to the carnage that was about to begin. The point of no return had been crossed in a spray of blood and silver, and as Kael shifted into the massive, black-furred beast of his lineage, he knew that only one of them would see the sun rise. Chapter 16, The Falling Star. The stone floor of the high square was slick with a treacherous mixture of rain and the first spills of a civil war. Kael, in his hulking wolf form, was a whirlwind of shadow and tooth, but even a king could be buried under a mountain of lesser beasts. Because he had prioritized the speed of his arrival over the gathering of his loyalist guard, he now found himself circled by Silas's elite enforcers. They moved with a cold, practiced synchronicity, wielding silver-tipped pikes that kept Kael's massive jaws at bay. Every lunging snap he made was met with a jagged thrust, carving fresh ribbons of heat into his flanks. He could see Lyra through the thicket of spears, her face a pale moon against the darkness of the executioner's block. She was struggling against her bindings, her eyes searching the shadows for Rowan with a desperation that hurt Kael more than the silver in his skin. The coup wasn't just a political shift, it was a systematic erasure of everything he had tried to reclaim. For every guard he sent sprawling with a swipe of his claws, 2 more rose to take their place, their sense a uniform wall of cold, unblinking betrayal. "You are fighting for a ghost, Kael," Silas shouted from the safety of the raised dais. "The pack has already turned. Look around you." Kael swung his massive head, his golden eyes scanning the ramparts. He saw his own generals standing motionless, their faces set in grim masks of neutrality. They weren't coming to help. They were waiting to see who would be left standing before they pledged their fealty. The realization was of freezing hollow in his chest. He had led these men through a dozen wars, shared meat and mead with them, yet they were watching him be dismantled like a stray dog. He let out a low, mournful howl that vibrated through the stones, a sound of a leader who had finally realized his throne was built on sand. Chapter 17, The Silence of the Grave. Deep within the bowels of the fortress, the damp air clung to Lyra's skin like a shroud. After the chaos of the square, she had been dragged down to the iron-barred cells, the scent of rot and old blood suffocating her senses. She pressed her face against the cold bars, her voice a hoarse whisper as she called out for Rowan. Because the silence that answered her was absolute, she felt a terrifying, numbing despair begin to settle into her bones. She had returned to this kingdom to reclaim her son's birthright, but instead, she had led him into a slaughterhouse. "He is safe for now, Lyra," a voice hissed from the shadows of the corridor. She turned, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. Elena stood in the torchlight, holding a small bundle wrapped in a silver moon cloak. Rowan was asleep, his breathing shallow but steady. Relief washed over Lyra so powerfully her knees buckled, but it was quickly replaced by a sharp, jagged suspicion. Elena wasn't a savior, she was a woman who dealt in the currency of leverage. "What do you want?" Lyra rasped, her fingers clutching the bars. "I want to survive the night," Elena whispered, her eyes darting toward the stairs where the sounds of fighting were growing distant. "Silas intends to kill the boy as soon as Kael is subdued. He wants no loose ends, no bloodline to haunt his new order. I may be ambitious, but I am not a child killer." "But Kael is losing, Lyra. He believes he has failed you again, and that belief is making him reckless." Lyra looked at her son, then toward the ceiling where the muffled roars of Kael's wolf echoed through the stone. She realized that they were all caught in a trap of Kael's making, a trap built of pride, secrets, and a crown that had become a curse. She reached through the bars, her hand brushing Rowan's hair, and felt a surge of raw, maternal fury. She couldn't wait for a king to save her. Kael was a man who had chosen the world over her once, she couldn't bet her son's life that he wouldn't fail again. Chapter 18, The King's Submission. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour by the time Kael was forced back to his human form, his body a map of silver burns and jagged lacerations. He knelt in the center of the square, his breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. Silas stood over him, the executioner's sword resting its heavy tip against the back of Kael's neck. The council guards stood in a tight circle, their torches sputtering in the wind. Kael looked up, his vision blurred by blood, and saw the heavy iron door of the dungeons being pushed open. "Bring the woman and the whelp," Silas commanded. Lyra was pushed into the light, her eyes wide as she saw Kael broken at Silas's feet. A guard held Rowan by the scruff of his tunic, the boy finally awake and crying out for his mother. The sound was a serrated blade across Kael's heart. He tried to rise, but a pike butt slammed into his wounded shoulder, pinning him back to the stones. He felt the cold steel of the greatsword bite into his skin, a reminder of his utter helplessness. "A choice, Kael Thorn," Silas rumbled, his voice dripping with a sickening triumph. "Submit. Sign the abdication. Declare the boy a bastard and the woman a harlot before the pack. Do this, and I will let them live in exile. Refuse, and you will watch their heads roll before I take yours." Kael looked at Lyra. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw a flickering flame of the woman who had once loved him. He realized with a devastating clarity that he would rather be remembered as a coward and a failure than live a single second in a world where they didn't breathe. The pride that had defined his life, the arrogance that had made him reject her 3 years ago, evaporated in the heat of his son's tears. "I submit," Kael whispered, the words tasting like poison. He lowered his forehead to the wet stone, the ultimate gesture of a defeated wolf. He heard the gasps of the remaining pack members, the sound of his reputation shattering into a million irreparable pieces. He was a king who had lost his crown, a warrior who had lost his honor, and a man who had finally realized that his throne was a worthless pile of rocks compared to the weight of his son's hand in his. As Silas laughed, a sound of pure, jagged malice, Kael felt a strange, cold peace. He had lost everything, and in that loss, he had finally found the man he was meant to be. Chapter 19, The Shadow's Loyalty. The heavy silence following Kael's submission was broken only by the rhythmic splash of rain against the cobblestones. Silas stepped back, his chest swelling with the toxic air of a victor, while the greatsword remained leveled at Kael's throat. Because the council believed they had finally broken the unbendable king, they failed to notice the shifting of the guards on the eastern ramparts. A low whistle, like the call of a midnight hawk, pierced through the gloom, and suddenly, the shadows at the edge of the square began to move with a lethal, coordinated intent. "The silver moon does not leave its own behind," a voice boomed from the darkness, vibrating with a familiar, gravelly authority. Alpha Darius stepped into the torchlight, but he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Kael's own first commander, a man who had supposedly remained neutral during the coup. Kael looked up from the mud, his eyes clearing just enough to see the Silver Moon warriors and the Shadowclaw loyalists standing shoulder to shoulder. Because he had saved Darius's life during a mountain pass ambush years ago, an act of mercy he had kept hidden even from his own council, that ancient debt was finally being repaid in the hour of his greatest need. "You betrayed your king for a scroll and a lie, Silas," the first commander roared, his sword clearing his scabbard with a sound like singing ice. "We do not follow the orders of traitors." The square erupted into a chaotic symphony of steel clashing against steel. Darius moved like a blur of silver fur, heading straight for the guard holding Rowan, while the loyalist Shadowclaws turned their pikes on the council's enforcers. Kael felt a surge of adrenaline that burned through the wolfsbane in his system. He didn't need a crown to lead, he only needed the ground beneath his feet and the knowledge that he wasn't alone. He surged upward, his hand closing around the ankle of the guard pinning him down, and with a feral snarl, he dragged the man into the dirt. Chapter 20, The Mirror of the Past. The fight moved with a dizzying, frantic pace, the high square becoming a meat grinder of shifting alliances. Lyra had been cut loose by a stray loyalist blade, and she was already a whirlwind of teeth and fury, clawing her way toward Rowan. Kael watched her for a heartbeat, his soul catching fire at the sight of her strength. Because they were finally fighting on the same side of the line, the fractured mate bond between them flared with a blinding, white-hot intensity that made his vision swim. "Kael! The archives!" Lyra shouted over the din, her eyes darting toward the tower where Silas was attempting to flee. "He has the original seals. He means to burn the evidence of the bloodline." Kael didn't hesitate. He knew that the fight in the square was won, but the fight for the truth was still hanging by a thread. He sprinted toward the archive tower, his boots skidding on the blood-slicked stones. Every breath was a jagged pain in his lungs, yet he felt faster and stronger than he had in years. He realized that for the first time, he wasn't fighting to protect his image or his authority, he was fighting to ensure his son would never have to grow up in the shadow of a lie. He reached the base of the tower just as Silas was barring the heavy iron door from the inside. Kael didn't look for a key. He didn't wait for reinforcements. He threw his entire weight against the wood, the impact jarring his wounded shoulder until he saw stars. Because he was fueled by 3 years of repressed guilt and a lifetime of hidden love, he hit the door again, the wood splintering under the sheer force of his desperation. He was no longer a king following a framework, he was a wolf reclaiming his den. Chapter 21, The Stage is Set. The top of the archive tower was a whirlwind of loose papers and flickering candles. Silas stood by the open window, a torch in one hand and the royal genealogy scrolls in the other. Below them, the kingdom was a map of fire and shadow, the sounds of the final skirmishes rising up like the roar of a distant ocean. Kael stepped onto the landing, his human form covered in grime and gore, his eyes locked on the parchment that held the history of his family's pain. "It ends here, Kael," Silas sneered, his back to the drop. "Even if you kill me, the world will only remember that you knelt." They will remember the king who broke for a woman. Let them remember whatever they want, Kael said, his voice as calm and cold as a winter morning. I didn't kneel for the woman. I knelt for my son. And that makes me a better man than you will ever be. Because he saw Silas's hand begin to tilt the torch toward the scrolls, Kael lunged. It wasn't a strategic move, it was a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble. They tumbled together across the stone floor, the torch rolling toward a pile of dry records. Kael ignored the heat, his hands finding Silas's throat with a precision that was terrifying. He didn't just want the scrolls, he wanted the man who had stolen his life to look into his eyes and see the exact moment his legacy died. Through the window, the first hint of gray light began to bleed into the horizon. The execution ceremony in the square had failed, and now, the stage was set for a public exposure that would either heal the pack or scatter it to the winds. Kael gripped the scrolls tightly to his chest, the weight of the evidence finally in his hands. He could hear Lyra's voice calling his name from below, and for the first time since the night he rejected her, he felt like he could finally look at the sun without flinching. Chapter 22, The King on His Knees. The sun tore through the heavy clouds like a golden claw, illuminating the carnage of the high square in a raw, unforgiving light. The fighting had ceased, leaving a heavy, metallic silence that smelled of spent adrenaline and damp earth. Kael emerged from the archive tower, his gait uneven, his hand clutching the original fertility scrolls against his bloody chest. Thousands of wolves stood in the amphitheater, their eyes wide as they watched the man they once called king descend into the light. He wasn't the distant, untouchable monarch of yesterday, he was a man held together by grit and the sheer, agonizing weight of his own redemption. Stepping onto the executioner's platform, the very stage where he had been forced to submit hours before, Kael looked out at his people. He saw the doubt, the confusion, and the lingering fear. Because he had spent his life believing that vulnerability was a death sentence for a leader, his next move felt like the ultimate sacrifice. He didn't raise his sword. He didn't demand an oath of fealty. Instead, he turned toward Lyra, who stood at the edge of the dais holding Rowan. Slowly, deliberately, Kael Thorn sank to both knees before the entire kingdom. I rejected my queen once to save a crown that was already rotting from within, Kael's voice boomed, shattering the silence with its raw, jagged honesty. I chose the lies of traitors over the truth of the woman who held my soul. I was a king of stone, but today, I stand before you as a man of flesh. He held up the scrolls, the royal seals catching the morning light. These records prove the infertility was a fabrication, a weapon used by the council to drive a wedge between the throne and the heart of this pack. My son is the true heir, not by law alone, but by the blood and fire that brought him back to us. The collective gasp of the pack sounded like the wind through the pines. Kael looked directly at Silas, who was being dragged forward in chains by Darius. The elder's face was a mask of defeated malice. Kael didn't order an execution. He didn't need to. He simply handed the scrolls to the first commander and turned his full attention back to Lyra. The public claiming wasn't a decree of ownership, it was an act of absolute, naked surrender. Chapter 23, The Weight of Trust. The afternoon shadows were long and gentle in the royal solar, a stark contrast to the violence of the dawn. The heavy obsidian throne remained empty, a silent witness to a transition that no one had expected. Kael stood by the hearth, the warmth of the fire finally beginning to seep into his battered bones. He had spent the last several hours stripping the council of their titles and elevating the loyalists who had stood by the truth. Because he had realized that power without love was a hollow vessel, he felt a strange, quiet peace in the uncertainty of what came next. Lyra entered the room, her presence a soft, rhythmic hum that settled his restless wolf instantly. She wasn't wearing the white gown of a sacrificial lamb, she was dressed in the dark leathers of a warrior, her auburn hair loose and wild. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze searching his face for the man he used to be. "The pack is calling for a coronation, Kael," she said, her voice a low, steady vibration. "They have a king, Kael replied, turning to face her. But they do not yet have the leader they deserve. He reached into his mantle and pulled out the heavy, iron-wrought crown of the Shadow Claws. He didn't place it on his own head. Instead, he walked toward her and pressed the cold metal into her hands. The gesture was a silent admission of his failure and a symbol of his absolute trust. I will not rule beside you until I have earned the right to stand there. Until then, you are the voice of the Shadow Claw. The pack needs to see that the bloodline is safe in the hands of the woman who never wavered. Lyra looked down at the crown, her fingers tracing the jagged peaks of the iron. Because she saw the genuine, unvarnished humility in his eyes, she felt the final barrier of her heart begin to crack. She didn't put the crown on. She set it on the table between them, a bridge instead of a barrier. She stepped into his space, her scent of honey and rain finally overwhelming the smell of wood smoke and old blood. We rule together, Kael. Not as a king and a consort, but as two halves of a whole. But this time, there are no secrets. Chapter 24, The Morning After. 1 year later, the Blackwood forests were alive with the sound of the great hunt, but the atmosphere was one of joy rather than desperation. Kael stood on the balcony of the high palace, watching a small, dark-haired boy chase a golden-furred pup across the training grounds. Rowan's laughter echoed up the stone walls, a sound that Kael still considered the greatest music he had ever heard. Because he had chosen to be a father before he was a king, his reign had become something he never thought possible, stable, respected, and genuinely loved. Lyra leaned against his side, her shoulder resting against his with a familiarity that had been forged in the fires of their shared trauma. She was no longer the whispered-about queen, she was the heart of the pack, a leader whose strength was matched only by her compassion. Kael reached out, his hand finding hers and interlacing their fingers. The mate bond was no longer a fractured thread, it was a vibrant, glowing chord that sang with the rhythm of their unified souls. He looks like you when he runs, Lyra whispered, a playful glint in her eyes. He has your spirit, Kael replied, pulling her closer. Heaven help the enemies of this pack when he comes of age. The sun was high in the sky, illuminating a kingdom that had been reborn from the ashes of its own pride. Kael looked down at the iron crown resting on a velvet cushion nearby. It was just a piece of metal now, a tool rather than a god. He had lost his throne to find his family, and in the end, he had gained something far more enduring. He turned to Lyra, his voice a soft, private murmur that was for her ears alone. Choose me, he whispered, echoing the words from a year ago. She smiled, a brilliant, blinding expression that made the world around them fade into insignificance. I chose you the moment you knelt in the mud, Kael Thorn. And I will choose you every morning until the moon falls from the sky. As they watched their son play in the light of a new era, the king who had rejected his mate realized that redemption wasn't a destination he had reached. It was a path he would walk every day, held steady by the hand of the woman who had taught him that the greatest power a man could possess was the courage to be vulnerable. The world hadn't burned after all, it had simply been purged, leaving behind a love that was stronger than any crown.